A little bit of context about today's interview. I, on my main channel, made a video about quitting sugar for 30 days because I'm trying to get YouTube famous, but also I learned so much about myself and nutrition and the food landscape in the United States and our culture and how ingrained this highly addictive substance is into like what we consume on a daily basis. It was a wonderful experiment. I'll link that video in the show notes or the description if you're on YouTube. But during that video, I interviewed a nutritionist, a guy named Jonathan Isabel, and I'm going to be putting up an interview with him in a few weeks. But Jonathan spoke very highly of today's guest. He's a resident of LA. That's where he was born and raised. He also received a bachelor's degree in social science from the University of Southern California. He's also a product of the rave scene from the late 90s and early 2000s. So he was a partier and then turned his life around and is now a doctor. He has an amazing backstory. David, during his senior year at USC, discovered health and wellness. This led him to being a personal trainer during his senior year. He found that one-on-one coaching was transformative and its effects were incredibly rewarding. You can see this if you do a dive into his Instagram. You don't have to look very far for it to become very clear and obvious that David has a passion for sharing information that has helped and enriched his life, and he wants to share that to help you and to enrich your life as well. After developing his newfound interest in nutrition, David enrolled at California State University Northridge, where he earned a Master's of Science, Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food Science. He interned at UCLA, where he specialized in eating disorders. He's also the founder of Nutrition and Recovery, which was founded in 2012. Nutrition and Recovery is a group practice of dietitians who work with people who are at the intersection of alcohol and food eating disorders. He studied public health at UCLA and received a PhD in community health sciences with a minor in health psychology. His PhD dissertation examined the link between early life adversity and mental health. His work revolves around trauma and trauma-informed nutrition. This talk was fascinating. It was very eye-opening for me as I start to embark on my journey into the world of becoming a more mindful consumer in the world of nutrition. And I think that I actually know that you're going to find a whole wealth of knowledge right after I stop talking and we get into the interview. So without further ado, here is my interview with Dr. David Wiss.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's been a long road trying to move forward the conversation around nutrition for mental health. And, there's certain areas where it's well accepted, eating disorders. We've done a lot of work to make nutrition for addiction recovery become a thing. And now there's a lot of buzz around nutrition for depressive symptoms, anxiety, and, really the buzzword now is how to provide trauma-informed care. So it's exciting to be a part of a revolution, which is changing the language around nutrition.
It's amazing that you're doing that. It's also interesting to me that we are at a point of affluence as a culture where we have to start having the talk about the abundance of food, because for a long time it was eat whatever you can to survive. And now we have this engineered food landscape where, even if you wanted to grow your own food, you'd have to almost detach yourself completely from society. And being inside of society comes with its own set of problems. That, like when I was doing the no sugar video, it is crazy how much I felt like I was removing myself from the matrix when I was walking through the grocery store. Yeah. And I think there's a big pushback, or there was, it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a big pushback against people even saying that food addiction is a thing because we all have to eat to survive. And I'm wondering if you have a theory on if that's because people don't think there's any scientific basis in that, or if it's a little bit of like the food industry kind of like trying to discredit like the word or the phrase food addiction.
Yeah, I think originally the strong evidence came in animal models. There was a lot of sugar addiction models in rodents, and it took a while for us to have robust data for humans. And there was a tool validated, the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which has now been used in over 1,000 studies. I think there's over 2,000 peer-reviewed papers that mention food addiction. So it's undeniable. And I think the pushback comes from the nutrition world, which is highly influenced by big food. My personal um, organization, registered dietitian nutritionists, don't seem to embrace it the way other fields do. And I think there's two reasons. One is because my field is highly influenced by industry, who loves the message of personal responsibility, which, you know, really allows big corporations to put private profits ahead of public health. And the other reason is that a lot of registered dietitians work with eating disorders. And when you work with eating disorders, you do run across people that have deeper underlying issues. There's a lot of body dissatisfaction, a lot of dieting, and a lot of diet culture. And so we know that efforts to restrain eating for a lot of people trying to lose weight, going on diets, is also a risk factor for food addiction. And so the major debate that I've been working to help resolve is this idea of food addiction as an independent, quote unquote, disorder compared to food addiction symptoms that derive from diet culture and people really trying to, you know, go on extreme diets, which essentially can lead to addiction like eating and binge eating. So I think there's a difference between the person that was a survivor of early life trauma, exposed to a lot of highly palatable foods, and developed a dependency on, you know, processed foods to reduce negative affect, the process by which someone becomes addictive, repeated exposure, and it changes the brain chemistry. Like, that's a well-established part of the food addiction picture. But again, there's also a lot of people that didn't have food addiction until they went on the keto diet or tried to quit something and then started binging and then, right? So there's a need to discern between these different food addiction phenotypes. And hopefully we can talk about some of that today.
Yeah, and I wanted to approach you from the standpoint of serving my audience who are attracted to my story. And I have a background with food that is not great. Grew up in a small Midwestern town where the Mountain Dew flowed like water. We grew up eating Little Debbie's for breakfast, and I watched the way my mother, I love her to death, and she's becoming more food conscious, but I watched the way that she kind of like grandmothered my child. And it would be, when you're at grandma's house, you get sugar. It's a way to show love. And personally, I think that I developed part of my addictive personality. Maybe it's genetics. I think there's a lot of like argument about whether or not it's nature versus nurture in that world. If I do have the gene for it, I don't think I was done any favors by constantly like having these artificial spikes in dopamine and pleasure by continually being in a state of like chasing my next high, if you will, because I never had any restriction with sugar. And I don't think that sets you up well for the future. And people kind of think I'm crazy about watching my stepdaughter, who has a dad that's an addict. I'm 100 days off of alcohol now, and I'm exploring whether or not I'm actually an addict, what that looks like. I know that I have that tendency, and I see her immediately ask for more sugar after she gets a hit. And I'm like, oh my gosh. People downplay that, I think, because they're like, it's just food, it's just sugar, that's what kids are supposed to do. But like, personally, I think for me and for other people, having that kind of behavior or having that kind of relationship with food can translate into addictions later in life. And the inverse is also true. I see my friends that are in recovery, and you've talked about this in one of your works about being addicted to caffeine. When you grow up and you become an addict and you get rid of drugs or alcohol, you revert back to like having high amounts of sugar, donuts, coffee. So is that a symbiotic relationship? Do you think what I'm saying is true?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a lot of interest in the conversation of cross addiction and genetic susceptibility. We see a lot of people that have severe food addiction that don't have other addictions because food is the real main love, right? There's nothing that can really compete with it. But oftentimes we'll see some sort of addiction in the family history. So for example, if someone does grow up with a genetic legacy of alcohol or drug use, there is definitely a predisposition to addiction-like behaviors. And when someone finds food at an early age and really develops a relationship to it over time, you know, some people will end up with the caffeine, nicotine, drugs, alcohol, behavioral addiction problem where they're cross addicted into a lot of things. And this is oftentimes characterized by an impulsive profile. An individual might just be very disinhibited with respect to behavior. But one point that's worth making in support of the food addiction argument is that, yes, we need food to survive, but we don't need highly processed, highly palatable, engineered food. One of the most convincing arguments that I've heard in favor of food addiction is that if you look at drugs of abuse like cocaine, the coca leaf itself is not highly addictive, but it's only when we remove the fibers and take the extracts and then process it further does it hijack the brain. And the same argument could be made for the poppy plant, right? Which doesn't destroy human life the way heroin does. And if you look at foods of abuse, you look at corn. Most people would say corn's not addictive, but once you remove the fibers and you get corn syrup and high fructose corn syrup, you're actually dealing with byproducts rather than the actual food in its quote unquote natural state.
Hey, what's up, friends? Pardon my quick interruption. Here is my sponsored post voice where I'm trying to sell you a thing that you need. I am just joking. I'm not trying to sell you anything. But I would like to make you aware of my newsletter. Just like all of the cool kids on the internet, I've got a newsletter. Mine is free. I talk about the different things I've been learning about, the things I've been discovering that have enhanced my life, and I let you know about it. It comes out every Monday. The newsletter is free. It will always be free, and there is a link in the bio of this video. Just tap that, go and sign up for the Better Together newsletter. And thank you so much for being here. And back to the scheduled program. Bye now. Yeah, it's so crazy that we live in the world of highly processed and engineered food. And I don't know what the right or the wrong way is with this. And you had told me that you didn't want to be an advocate for restrictive cycles of dieting for good reason. I am on like this journey, and I'm like 4 or 5 years into like really paying attention to like my health and wellness. But I noticed a pattern whenever I'd quit like alcohol for 30 days or quit junk food for 30 days, I'd go back into it with full force. But what I have noticed after repeatedly doing these like restricted like periods is that food starts to taste different to me. And I've just like slowly learned over time that maybe I shouldn't ingest as much of the processed stuff. Can you give, I don't want to, I know you're a doctor, and I know you're not going to answer anything off of assumption, which is great, but do you think there's any merit to me doing the 30-day restrictive cycles? Is there a different approach I should be taking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's been some good research on cravings and food cravings, and it's very clear that when someone eliminates a particular food or ingredient, the cravings do go up in the short run, right? Mm-hmm. There's definitely some evidence for withdrawal-like symptoms. The brain is used to getting a certain amount of dopamine, and when it no longer gets it, it finds a way of revolting and creating negative emotions, which bring the person back to the substance. But over the long term, when you reduce exposure to addiction-like substances, cravings do diminish and potentially extinguish, right? And so, being able to stay off sugar, for example, as you mentioned, it's so ubiquitous in society. It requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of social support, and it really requires learning how to cook for yourself. We live in a world full of convenience, and I think that's one of the biggest barriers people have to being able to change their food, is that it does require getting your hands dirty and getting active in the kitchen and going to the grocery store. And a lot of people struggle with the life skills needed to feed themselves, especially given, the convenience aspect of the food that's out there.
For sure. You said you're 14 years sober, correct?
I am 15 and a half.
Congratulations, first. Second, I don't know how much you're willing to go into that.
Sure, not a problem.
In your road to 15 and a half years sobriety, was there, did you quit everything cold turkey? Did you have a period where you relapsed and got back on? And I'm asking this because I think someone that listens to me may listen to this and they may be struggling and they may be beating themselves up and having negative self-talk. And I can speak from my personal experience that me being sober for as long as I have now, which is, just 100 days, but that's like an amazing feat. Me eating better. I've changed my diet. I'm like whole food plant-based right now. I'm on almost an entire year of daily running. So from the outside, someone may be like, oh, he's got it together. But like I relapsed a lot and I failed a lot. And I was wondering if you had a similar story or what that was like for you at the beginning of transitioning from the rave scene, someone that never had any kind of like experience in the wellness world, and like what that transitional period was like.
Yeah, it was a definite journey for me. It took me nearly 2 years of going to, different facilities and having my own health issues, legal issues, and finally got sober in 2006, where, of course, there was other addictions. I remember waking up to 5 shots of espresso on ice and smoking a pack a day. And those are all normative behaviors in the quote unquote recovery culture. And I think a lot of people are comfortable with it. But, at some point, for me, really wanting to know what it would be like to have a free mind and to not be consumed with substance related thoughts became really, really enticing to me. And so, I was able to quit smoking around 7 months. And I got really into exercise. And I think I could admit that I probably took the exercise thing a bit too far. You couldn't have told me that at the time. If anyone would have tried to push back on me at the time, there would have been an argument there. But in retrospect, you could see like the level of dependence, and it makes sense. If someone's susceptible to neurochemical extremes, there's going to be extremes with behavior. And the thing that I've struggled with the most in my 15 and a half years has been the caffeine, because, I've noticed that when I don't have it at all, I have less anxiety. And it's just, when you're not overactivating the reward systems, your body's able to be in a calmer state more often. And it's the thing that I know to be true, but I seem to always go back to after, I had 8 months off. I take weeks off here and there, but the call always returns. I'll be in an airport or something, jet lagged. I'm actually drinking coffee this morning. So the journey continues.
That is so the mind of the addict. It's like, I know that this is a destructive behavior, but I don't care. And I think a lot of people maybe probably know that cognitively, so they like indulge in micro amounts. But I've been saying lately, and maybe it's just me deflecting, but I've said that I think that addiction presents itself in every human. And that's a scale from 1 to the person that's like, I only have 1 beer once a month or whatever it is, all the way up to like full blown. We know those people. Those are the people that when we were in our deepest, darkest state, we're like, well, I might have a problem, but I'm not as bad as Adam. So that means I'm cool. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing, because my next question was, what's your current addiction? And you said coffee. I'm wondering if you think that it is possible for someone that has an addictive mindset or an addictive personality to rewire their brain. And I know we're dipping our toes into different waters than like what your profession is, but I'm just wondering if you have like any thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I believe in recovery. I believe in resilience. I believe that people can bounce back, engage in wellness behaviors, get healing from trauma. But in that question, it is important to think about the drivers, the underlying drivers. If they're very much biological, for example, we know that some people have, altered reward based on dopamine receptors and things of that nature. It's going to be more challenging to quote unquote rewire the brain versus someone that had addiction-like behaviors that were more circumstantial. If you think about the person that didn't have a lot of early life trauma, had a pretty successful life with healthy relationships and got injured and ended up on painkillers and then got strung out on opioids, right? That might be a different case than the person who really crossed the line early on and had a decade of exposure to alcohol and methamphetamine. So I think whenever I try to talk about addiction, and this goes for food addiction as well, it's important not to lump it all into one category. It's important to think about the different phenotypes, those that are, more, like I said, biological versus cases that are more perhaps psychological. And I don't mean to separate biology from psychology, but there's definitely different phenotypes of addiction that respond differently to different forms of recovery. And for some people, abstinence is the only way. And many people would argue that, if someone has truly addictive neurochemistry, that being abstinent is going to be the only successful path forward. But there's a lot of people that find that after separation from the substance, after doing some good healing work, lots of years of exercise, lots of good sleep, yoga, breath work, meditation, that the brain can be rewired in a way that can allow for what a lot of people would call harm reduction or moderation. And, we definitely see that with food, probably more so than with something like alcohol, meth, or heroin.
Yeah. I've had this logical discussion with my buddy who's been sober for 3 or 4 years at this point. I've had this discussion a lot where I say, I think that you could have one beer, and I think that I could have one beer. I know I actually have plenty of times. And I think to say that you can't is just denying like all logic. It's like, even if it means that you have one and then you're locked away. And I keep going back and forth on this argument. I'm like, maybe I should never even make that because maybe I'm missing the point. With my alcohol consumption, I felt like I was at a place where I was practicing moderation, but the further I go down this rabbit hole of being completely sober all the time, it doesn't even logically make sense to me to do it like for one night. So I'm like, am I just now addicted to like feeling my best all the time, or is that the right or the wrong thing? And I don't know if you can provide any kind of insight to me on this, because I'm kind of struggling. Like, I think that like after a year of, because right now I'm committed to 1 year of sobriety, 1 year no alcohol. I've been talking about my YouTube, and people seem to be like resonating with this. And some people are like, why would you even consider going back? So right now I have no desire to like go back with moderation. So is that me just being addictive in the opposite direction?
Well, if someone is susceptible to extremes, then they're going to be susceptible to extremes. And I think to achieve sobriety or abstinence, it does require some extremes. I mean, there's people that won't use Listerine because it has trace amounts of alcohol in it. And to my earlier point, I think it's wise to discern between the person with alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, who once they start drinking ends up drinking 12 drinks, 15 drinks, and goes to blackout, right? They have a strong craving cascade where there's loss of control, and it really is a debacle, right? That night of drinking is just filled with days of guilt, shame, and remorse afterwards, versus the person who has a few drinks one night, doesn't drink 12 drinks, but then the next night, there's a strong signal to repeat that behavior, right? And I think this is an important discernment with food too. There's people that have this more classic binge eating disorder where once they start, there's going to be major loss of control, versus the person that might have more addiction-like symptoms where they may not finish the ice cream that night, but you better believe at 10 o'clock the next night, the brain's going to say, hey, there's that thing in the freezer. Let's go.
So you're saying some people don't have that? My gosh, that must be nice, man. So I'm working on this like short film, like intro for this video, where I want to like put the viewer inside the mind of what it is to be an addict. And I want to do this scene where I'm eating a chip and I have one and I'm like, just have one. And it's just this back and forth. And then I have 5. And then I'm like, well, you already broke the promise to yourself, so you might as well have the entire thing. And people that say food addiction isn't real, I'm like, man, I have, from someone that's done like cocaine and done like almost name a drug, I've, been there, done that. The internal dialogue is the exact same. Maybe the pull isn't as strong, but for sure, whether it's ice cream or heroin or alcohol, like the entire internal dialogue is exactly the same. And I think for me, the biggest thing has been letting go of the shame and just acknowledging that's a part of my brain.
Sure, exactly. And a lot of the work we do clinically is to help people with some of these cognitive distortions, right? If there is that same narrative of, I'm doing none, I'm walking on eggshells. Once I do a little, I lose control completely. That's likely going to play out, right? And that's a true scenario for many people, but there's always nuance. So for example, there's a difference between eating a chip after a rough day at work when you haven't had dinner yet and you're sitting down for television in a rough mood versus having a chip that was part of a well-balanced meal with the love of your life in a really good emotional state, right? And so one could argue that the chip is definitely a vector, a biological vector that affects our neurochemistry, but it's also something that should be looked at in context, right? In context of the meal, in context of the day, in context of someone's entire lifespan. And so I'm a big fan of abstinence. I'm a big fan of, addiction models, but I do think that for, realistically, there's such a wide range of ways people present with addiction-like behaviors that failing to look at the nuance and the context sometimes misses, the whole story.
So the biggest thing that I've noticed from abstinence and 30-day challenges and whatnot is that I will be living my life and I'll be in situations where normally I'd be on autopilot. I come home, it's 5 o'clock, pour a bourbon, make dinner. Don't think about it. Or, like you were saying, come home, sit down, eat chips, watch TV. Don't think about it. I don't do that, but I grew up watching my dad do that all the time. Come home, eat chips. Oddly, he was really weird. If we wanted some, like we'd go to get a chip. And he's like, I don't want them anymore. So I'm like, that's a psychological tale for another day. But noticing the neurological ladder that I've built for myself, whether it's through meditation or through periods of restriction, has really helped me pay attention to the triggers. So could you maybe just kind of surmise again, one piece of advice for someone that is trying to figure out how to stop binging, whether it's with, not whether it's with food, but stop binging in the context of food?
Yeah, great question. And just a quick point about the word restriction. I think it's ill-defined, right? I work with eating disorders, so I address issues of restriction and deprivation often with people. But, one could argue that not eating highly processed food manufactured for profit is not restriction because those foods don't actually exist in nature. Whereas someone else would argue that this is the food environment, this is what we got. If you don't eat what's being served, you're being restrictive. So I think one of the ways that's helpful is to think about restraint and restriction as part of a psychological profile and the intention. What's the intention behind it? Is it to lose weight? Or is it to truly achieve a neurochemical balance and to have inner peace, right? And I think with food, that's an important thing to think about for each person. So people that are actively trying to lose weight often do binge eat because they undereat. So the biggest risk factor for overeating is undereating. And that's one of the most accessible, low-hanging fruit for some people. If they're binge eating in the evening time, well, it's pretty common that they don't eat breakfast, right? Because there's overeating at nighttime, breakfast skipping. And so addressing undereating issues is kind of step one when we start to think about binge eating. And one of the easiest ways is to just distribute food throughout the course of the day. The international most recognized food plan, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with some optional snacks, right? But of course, when there is addiction like neurochemistry, some people find that even after they normalize their eating and start eating regular meals and snacks, they're still maybe binge eating at night. And they're like, well, I tried to eat more during the day and I'm still binge eating at night. Therefore, I'm just going to eat less during the day. And then the cycle sort of continues, right? With respect to binge eating, I always think about a couple contributing factors. And I never like to think that there's one factor. It's always several things that are at play. So we think about imbalanced nutrition, under eating, right? There's also negative emotions or negative affect, which contribute to eating. Some people refer to this as emotional eating. And then there's also opportunity. right? If the food is there, it's very different than if the food isn't, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so when those three things are all present, it's usually a risk factor for binge eating. So if someone's not eating enough food during the day, they're having a rough go, life seems stressful, and then the food is there, it's going to be very difficult for most people to resist temptation. And, some people are able to get recovery in a quote unquote toxic food environment. I work with a lot of people who are trying to recover from binge eating, but they live with a family with kids and there's kid food around. And it's like, there's the cupboard filled with kids food and they've got to maintain their recovery and not engage in that food. Some people find that extremely difficult. So, some people can clean up their kitchen and clean up their home food environment, but we now know that you can get food delivered to your door within a few minutes pretty easily. And so it makes things complicated for people for sure.
Dude, the family dynamic it's so real. When I switched to being plant-based, everyone, first, it's very extreme to tell people that you're going to be vegan and people have a lot of pushback, but it's like every other thing I've ever done in my life. Even when I was talking about not drinking, my fiance at the time was like, well, what are we going to do socially? Like, she was just scared of the change. So if you're listening to this and you want to make the change, just be patient. Like in my experience, I had to like decide to change, but then slowly it's been like a few years now and people are like, okay, you seem like you're in a better mood. My fiance is like, you look more handsome because you don't have all like the fat on you from like the processed food and alcohol and whatnot. I did want to ask you about, I'm a night eater and I feel like I've always been like this. And maybe it was because of scarcity of food growing up or sugar addiction. I definitely feel like shame is at the core of a lot of the addictive decisions I've made. And I thought when I was drinking and I'd go to sleep and I'd wake up that sometimes I may just be more drunk than when I went to bed, which is how alcohol is processed through the body. But that was what led me to eating food. I now still will wake up completely sober at 2 a.m. and want to come down and eat ice cream or food. So you know very little about me, but you know more than you did 40 minutes ago. Do you have any kind of like insider speculation? Ask me questions if you need to like kind of like help me try to brainstorm this in the next like 15 minutes, which is an absurd ask, I know, but
yeah, I've worked with a lot of people with night eating syndrome, and there's some different terms in the medical literature to describe it. Like I said, one of the first things we try to address is make sure the person's eating enough during the day. So if, for example, one of the macronutrients is low and now you're asleep, your body's going to have some mechanisms that promote its own survival by which will signal for food. And I think a lot of people have a difficult time realizing that even if someone lives in a larger body, right, has a quote unquote BMI of, above normal, even if someone has a BMI of 32, I'm just making up numbers, which would be considered obese by our standards. And a lot of people don't like that word anymore. The body can still perceive deprivation, lack, and restriction. And I think a lot of people think that, oh, well, I have a lot of excess energy on my body, but that's not how the brain works. We're wired for survival. And so that's, like I said, one possibility. Another possibility could be blood sugar. For example, we know that alcohol in the short term might affect blood sugar as a raise, but it can also drop it as well. We have data to show that when the pancreas releases insulin, it can drive the glucose down too far. So it's very possible. And I've had a lot of people check their blood sugar when you wake up at 2 a.m. It's possible that you could have had a dip in blood sugar.
That is such a good idea. You wrote a research paper linking alcohol to diabetes. It was published in a scientific journal recently, right? Yeah. If you remember, will you send that link to me? Because I think I closed out of it, and I'll link that in the show notes for people.
Excellent. Yeah. It was a cross-sectional study design, which showed that A1C, which is a marker of blood sugar over several months, goes down as alcohol consumption goes up, which really can show how alcohol can cause blood sugar dysregulation and can lead to eating behavior that would feel out of control. There's a lot of cases of night eating syndrome that isn't explained by any of that, right? We look at nutrition throughout the day. We look at blood sugar. Now it's like, what else, right? Is there medications involved? There's
no medication for me, like none. Like occasionally ibuprofen, like maybe very little is anything going into my body other than like food.
Yeah, and there's also this new area of inquiry around gut bacteria and circadian rhythms, right? It turns out that human beings have our own circadian rhythms, but the bacteria that live inside of us also live on circadian rhythms. And this is also closely related to hormones. So what we do basically informs what we will do, right? We teach our brain what to expect based on what we expose it to. So if someone eats every day at 2 a.m., you're essentially teaching your body that food is going to be coming at 2 a.m. And so it's very possible that you could have hunger hormones increase, changes in blood sugar, your gut bacteria could be ready for feeding. And that's what makes this, craving thing feel so difficult for some people. So I always believe that in order to address binge eating and night eating, really addressing physiology, through good sleep, good nutrition, regular exercise patterns, minimizing extremes can be very, very helpful to getting back to trusting your body as opposed to being susceptible to these physiological swings that, when people lose control and you do something against your will, it doesn't feel good. And, there's, like you said, the guilt and the shame and the remorse the next day. And that just leads for a need for more addiction-like behaviors, right? And thus the cycle continues.
The shame of waking up with hands and you're like, did I murder someone last night? Oh no, it's wing sauce. That's a real shame. It's almost like, texting someone you up at like 3 a.m. after like a night of hard drinking. It's so embarrassing. Is it TDL the thing that like it fluctuates in your body, the hormone that they're talking about with like your circadian rhythm in your gut, like the TDL levels get higher at times where you normally eat?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to speak on the cascade there. The major hunger hormone is ghrelin.
Ghrelin, that's what it is. TDL is about ghrelin. That's it. That's 100%. Okay. So I wonder, do you think that of course there's a possibility. Do you think that there's a good possibility that ghrelin for me is increased at 2 a.m. because that's just what I taught myself to do after years of being a bartender and just treat my body like crap. And like, I always did it at that same time for, like a decade or something.
It's not unlikely. I think the more likely mechanism is that your brain is expecting a dopamine surge. It's expecting some reward. And that's probably a driver of behavior, but the ghrelin system interacts with the dopamine system. So I think it's very possible that through hunger hormones, ghrelin, the dopamine system, and the gut bacteria, right? It creates a physiological craving that can feel very difficult for people to control. And I would say that one of my major recommendations for people with night eating, and this might be helpful to you as well, is like still eat breakfast the next morning. That feeling of, oh, I ate so much during the night, therefore I'm not going to eat breakfast and go until, 2 o'clock. It really does sort of repeat that cycle of, very little food in the first half of the day, most of the food in the second half of the day.
Yeah. Man, I am super disciplined, and this may be the addictive personality, but like if I do, like, let's say 48 hours of no food fasting, I might wake up at 2 a.m., but the urge to go to the kitchen does not feel very strong. It's because I'm so like laser focused on doing the 48 hours. With drinking, I'm so laser focused on not doing it for an entire year. With running, I'm so focused on doing it every day. The thought of not doing it doesn't even enter into my consciousness. Is there a possibility, or can you give me like a quick like roadmap, like some like, GPS instructions maybe on like, how do I, or can I stop being such a maniac and live within the world of moderation where I do that on autopilot? Or do I just embrace that I'm an insane person? And maybe that's not fair to say to myself, but do I just embrace that that's the way I work, and do I learn to leverage that?
Yeah, I think I embraced that in my journey. It was like, I'm extreme. I have neurochemical extremes. I'm susceptible. I'm going to roll with this. I did a lot of, like I said, extreme exercising and experimented with different dietary approaches. And it feels empowering at the time because you really want to see what's possible, right? Push it to the limits. And it's incredible, but it can have long-term consequences, right? So by doing a lot of fasting, some people can do it with impunity, by the way, but people that have any history of mental health issues or neurochemical imbalance, i.e. addictions, you know, it can really set up rebound swings later in life. So for example, one of the most fascinating areas of research that I've seen, and I see it often in my clinical practice, people that have used a lot of appetite suppressing stimulant medications. So for example, you know, Adderall or Ritalin, when you suppress your appetite during their 20s, they find that they're binge eating in their 30s, right? People that do a lot of fasting in 1 year find themselves losing control with food the next year. So I think that there's a lot of focus on the 24 hours when it comes to nutrition. People use apps and track their calories and their macros and think about nutrition as this 24-hour ordeal. But I think it's really important to think about our relationship to food over the lifespan. What we do in terms of behaviors at one point in our life is going to affect our behaviors at other points in our life. So for example, in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of low-fat dieting. People learned to stay away from saturated fat and cholesterol, and a lot of people took to that. And now after, you know, a decade or 2 decades of low-fat dieting, you see people that binge eat on almonds, right? And foods that are, you know, in their natural state. They can't eat nuts or seeds because the body is so attuned to the experience. The reward systems have upregulated to assign more value to foods that have fat in them, right? And so the solution to that, and this is my opinion, isn't to, all right, let's spend the rest of your life avoiding nuts. It would be, let's like stabilize your neurochemistry through long-term nutrition and learn how to teach your brain that nuts aren't deprived anymore. So again, fasting is fun for people. It feels empowering, but some people can do it with no issues, and other people it leads to disordered and dysfunctional eating. So the mantra that I like to promote is consistency with food leads to consistency with life, right? If we can create consistent patterns of eating throughout the day, it's likely to create consistent emotions. And I think that that can be just helpful to consider, especially if someone's listening out there and they see people able to fast or do extreme diets and not have issues. And you're wondering, why is it that I have issues? You know, maybe it's worth thinking about that we're all different and that you don't want to extrapolate one person's story to you or to a general population.
Yeah, they say to compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today.
I like that.
Dude, I think having the confidence through doing different experiments or just trying different things is huge too. For me, the only way I've been able to like break the cycle of shame is to like keep doing things and having confidence in myself. I also talk about like people investing in their savings account, or not their savings, they're investing in their retirement account. Like they do that with money, but doing that with nutrition is just as, if not more important. And through running, like I've learned that I run today, not for tomorrow, but it's for the race that I have 6 months from now. So I think if you have something like that in your life, maybe that'll help you. That's helped me regulate how I'm eating. And when I look at like a bag of chips now, I'm like, I don't want to eat that today because it's like I know that that's going to affect how I run 3 days from now. So.
And similar with alcohol, a lot of people find that recovery is much easier when you don't demonize it and say, you know what, it's like, I can say for me, instead of like, I'm so angry at Jameson Irish whiskey, I'm so mad at heroin because a bunch of my friends died. It's more of a state of like, wow, those are incredible substances that have really done a number on my brain chemistry. And I love those things, but I respectfully bow out. Right. Yeah. A lot of people find that that approach to food is much more sustainable. So as opposed to being like, you know, the chips are evil, I hate blueberry muffins. It's maybe easier to say, those chips are delicious and there's nothing better than a good blueberry muffin, but they don't work well with my current lifestyle and neurochemistry. Therefore, I'm going to opt out, but I really want someone else to be able to enjoy them. It just creates more neutrality. And one of the messages of recovery that I got is that when you can get neutral to alcohol, it becomes much more, it's easier to stay sober as opposed to waging war against it. And one of the things that we try to get people to do is to be neutral toward food. And that doesn't mean you have to eat it in moderation. You can be neutral towards something and abstain from it, but it's about emotional neutrality, not holding a lot of charge. When there's a lot of charge in something, the charge is going to get transferred. And oftentimes it gets transferred in our behaviors.
Yeah. Oh man. Jordan Peterson has a talk with, I think, Theo Vaughn, a comic, about alcohol. And Jordan Peterson was the first time I heard someone say alcohol is amazing. And it's amazing because it works to cure you of all your ails, right? It's like, what ails you? You hear that all the time. So you have to find something that's equally amazing to replace alcohol with. And I think you are, and I know you're right, saying that if you demonize it, you're also lying. Like, we're really good at picking up bullshit. That's why, like, people that are talking about faking it to making it, it's like, maybe that worked in the 19th century, but like, people really pick up on authenticity and being genuine now. So like implementing that in your own life when you're like, no, yeah, heroin is amazing, but I can't do a little bit and then not do it. It ruins my life because it's so amazing, right? I think that is, yeah. You're very wise, sir, and I really appreciate it. I think that's a good place to kind of jump off ship. But before we go, I wanted to ask you if there's a podcast that you're listening to right now that you like.
Yeah, the Huberman Lab podcast is kicking butt. The intelligence of that man is always impressive to me, and I get a lot out of the science-based information. A lot of people, I think, are listening to that for the tools. He gives tools, right? Science-based tools for everyday living, and I like the background. I like the science, and I like learning about neurobiology from people that are real smart. And so, hats off to Huberman.
Awesome. And I would like if you could recall a book, a movie, a speaker, or just like a moment that kind of sticks out as like a pillar and a catalyst for you making the lifestyle change that you so epically made. Was it 15 years ago now? 10 years ago now? 20 years? What if there was one thing that maybe after this someone can go and be like, I want to read this or listen to this, someone who is like kind of like at the crux, like, I want to make a change and I need to hear something that's going to act like utilitarian. Was there something that you can like?
Yeah,
recall?
I scratched my head for a minute thinking, and I have something that came up. I was always big into rap music and hip hop culture. I grew up in Los Angeles, and that was such a huge part of my life. And it always seemed like in hip hop culture, the message was, drink alcohol, use drugs, get high, do what you want. And then one of my favorite groups of all time, Dead Prez, released a song early 2000s that was about healthy living. And I'm blanking on the name, but we'll get it in the show notes. And it really was about honoring what we put in our body and eating plant-based. And it really threw me for a loop at the time. I wasn't ready for it, but I listened to it. I was like, oh, wow, you can actually be cool and promote health at the same time. Wow, who knew? And I really tried to embody that in my career, is that, I'm a healthcare professional, but we got to make it fun and make it sexy. And it's so important for people who believe that, for example, eating, plant-based foods, high fiber vegetables and beans and stuff like that is, not accessible to them. And when you make it fun, and you cook your own food and you spice it up, people can feel connected to the earth, connected to nature. And I've had a few experiences when I was out on the river or out in nature where I really felt connected to the universe with a capital U. And I've gotten some really good downloads about taking care of myself in a way that's sustainable and meaningful. And, I don't know that I'll be someone that lives to 90 or 100, but I know that I've experienced a high quality of life in the last 15 years.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. And to kind of like paraphrase one of your last TikToks, thank you for helping myself realize the paradise that's within. And I like to talk about how I'm documenting my journey to get better, and in my community, we get better together. So thank you so much for being a part of that experience. Peace, love, namaste. And I'm so eternally grateful for you taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you for the chat today.
You're welcome, man.